what if the Chernobyl disaster was almost unimaginably worse? In the terrifying days after the explosion of Reactor 4, Soviet scientists realized they were facing a second, far more catastrophic threat. Deep beneath the tons of burning graphite and melting nuclear fuel, a new danger was brewing. A massive thermal explosion that, had it happened, could have ejected the rest of the core into the atmosphere. This wouldn't have made half of Europe a wasteland, as some myths claim, but it would have been a disaster of continental scale, poisoning major river systems and rendering huge swaths of land uninhabitable for centuries. An unthinkable catastrophe was not just a possibility, it seemed probable. The only thing standing in its way was a desperate, almost insane plan. And the only people on Earth who could pull it off weren't nuclear physicists or soldiers in advanced protective gear. They were coal miners, men of dirt and dust, summoned from the deep earth for a job so dangerous it was considered a suicide mission. To dig a tunnel by hand, directly under the melting, incandescent heart of a nuclear reactor. This is the story of what it was really like to be one of those men sent into a radioactive furnace to save a world that would never truly know their names. To understand the impossible task these miners faced, you first have to understand the doomsday machine they were sent to disarm. When Reactor 4 exploded on April 26, 1986, it was just the beginning. While firefighters fought the radioactive flames on the roof, a much slower nightmare was unfolding deep inside the reactor's shattered corpse. The nuclear fuel, control rods, graphite, and sand that had been dumped on it all melted together into a superheated radioactive lava. This stuff, later named corium, was one of the most toxic materials ever created by humankind, and it was on the move. This terrifying lava, burning at over 2,000 degrees Celsius, started melting its way down through the concrete floors of the reactor building. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, an unstoppable river of nuclear death. Soviet scientists, led by the courageous Valery Legasov, quickly saw where this was going. Directly beneath the reactor were massive pools of water, the bubbler pools, part of the plant's safety system. If this molten corium touched that water, the result would be a cataclysmic steam explosion. It wouldn't be a nuclear bomb, but its effects would be just as devastating. The sheer force would have been powerful enough to vaporize the rest of the fuel in Reactor 4, and likely damage the other 3 reactors at the plant. It would have blasted a colossal plume of radioactive particles high into the stratosphere, a cloud of death that would dwarf the first explosion. Winds would have carried this contamination across Ukraine, Belarus, and into Europe. The great rivers, like the Dnieper, which supplied water to millions, would be poisoned. Major cities like Kyiv could have become uninhabitable. The clock was ticking. Physicists figured they had weeks, at best, before the corium burned through the final concrete slab. The first heroic act to stop this was done by 3 engineers, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov, who waded through radioactive water to manually open the sluice gates and drain those pools. Their mission, often misreported as a suicide run, was a success. 2 of them are still alive today, and their bravery bought everyone precious time. But the threat wasn't gone. Scientists couldn't be sure all the water was drained, and another danger loomed. Even without a steam explosion, the corium could just keep melting downwards, breaching the foundations and seeping into the groundwater. From there, it would be a slow, silent, and irreversible ecological disaster, poisoning the Pripyat River, the Dnieper, and eventually the Black Sea. They needed a new plan to stop the meltdown. They needed to cool the beast from below. They needed to dig a tunnel. In the chaos of the exclusion zone, a government commission worked frantically. The world's top nuclear minds were trying to solve a problem with no precedent. How do you stop a reactor from melting its way into the earth? The initial ideas were desperate. One involved trying to freeze the ground beneath the reactor with liquid nitrogen, but it was deemed too complex and slow. The most viable plan that emerged was also the most terrifying. They would dig a chamber directly beneath the foundation of Reactor 4. Inside this chamber, they'd build a massive heat exchanger, basically, a giant refrigerator, and pour a thick concrete pad. This system would, they hoped, draw the heat out, solidify the corium above it, and stop it from burning through to the soil. It was a last line of defense. But on paper, it looked impossible. It meant digging a tunnel about 150 meters long from the neighboring building under the most lethally radioactive ground on the planet to a point right beneath the still burning core. And it had to be done now. There was no time for heavy tunneling machinery, which might create vibrations that could collapse the whole ruined structure. The job had to be done the old-fashioned way, with shovels, pickaxes, and pure human muscle. The call went out, not to the army or to construction crews, but to the one group of men who lived their lives in hellish conditions deep underground. The coal miners. The Ministry of Coal Industry took the job, calling on men from the Donbass region in Ukraine, and crucially from Tula in Russia, whose expertise in the local soil was considered essential. These weren't soldiers trained for patriotic sacrifice. They were civilians, men who battled darkness and dust for a paycheck. They were tough, hard-drinking, and fiercely pragmatic. They knew the smell of bad air and the fear of being buried alive. Now, they were being asked to enter a new kind of mine, where the danger wasn't just a cave-in, but an invisible killer that would poison them from the inside out. The recruitment was a mix of patriotic appeal and stark obligation. The miners were told their country needed them, that the fate of millions was on their shoulders. They were promised high pay, bonuses, and lifelong benefits. But underneath it all, the message was clear. This wasn't really a request. One miner later recalled a general explaining bluntly why they weren't rotating in fresh crews. It was expensive and complicated to bring in new men. They were, in the cold math of the state, a resource to be used until they were spent. And so they came, by train and by bus, to the poison land of Chernobyl to begin the most dangerous dig in human history. Who were these men? Before this, they were anonymous cogs in the Soviet industrial machine. They were husbands and fathers from cities like Donetsk and Tula, places built on coal. Their lives were already hard, defined by the grueling rhythm of the mines. Descending before sunrise and coming up after sunset, their faces were permanently stained with the black dust that settled into their skin. It was a brutal but respected profession that forged a unique kind of man, physically powerful, loyal, and possessed of a dark, fatalistic humor. When the call came, their reaction was complicated. There was fear, of course. They weren't stupid. Rumors of the invisible poison had already spread. But there was also a sense of duty, and maybe even professional pride. Digging tunnels was what they did. The government, personified by Coal Minister Mikhail Shadov, a respected former miner himself, came to speak to them. Unlike in some dramatizations, he didn't need to bully them with armed guards. Shadov went into the disaster zone himself to manage his men, and that earned their respect. He laid out the terrifying stakes and what was needed. They were promised the world: huge salaries, new apartments, cars, university spots for their kids, and pensions to care for their families. For men in a system where such things were often out of reach, these were powerful incentives. But they knew this wasn't a job offer. It was a draft. They were being sent to fight a war against an enemy they couldn't see, hear, or touch. They arrived at Chernobyl to find a world that looked deceptively normal. The sun was shining, birds were singing, it was May, and the Ukrainian countryside was in full bloom. But it was all a lie. The air, the soil, the very leaves on the trees were saturated with deadly radiation. One engineer recalled picking up black, glassy fragments from the ground, only to find out later they weren't asphalt, but chunks of the reactor's intensely radioactive graphite moderator. They were housed in camps miles away. Every day, armored personnel carriers drove them to the work zone, a huge pit next to the damaged building. From there, they'd descend to the mouth of the tunnel. Their protective gear, cloth face masks, and standard work clothes was almost useless. The gamma radiation pouring from the ground and the reactor above passed right through them. The dust they were about to inhale wasn't just silica. It was laced with radioactive isotopes. They were split into shifts, working around the clock 7 days a week. The urgency was suffocating. Every shovelful of sand was a race against the melting corium. A grim routine set in. The miners, men of darkness, were about to enter a new kind of underworld, where the heat came not from the Earth's core, but from the fractured atom. One communist miner made a proposal that his comrades universally supported: transfer our daily wages to a fund for those suffering. It was a gesture of profound solidarity. They were ready. The train moved slowly through the countryside, its heavy wheels clicking a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the rails. It was not a modern train, sleek and smooth, but an older, more functional model, the kind used for transporting soldiers or supplies. Its cars were long, with wooden benches, dim lights, and windows smudged with years of grime and smoke. The landscape outside rolled by at a deliberate pace, filled with birch forests, fields of green and yellow, and the occasional huddled village where little had changed since the war. Inside the train, the coal miners sat packed together, shoulder to shoulder, each with a bag slung at their feet. The men of Tula, Donetsk, and beyond. Some spoke in low voices. Others stared forward, their eyes fixed on a point somewhere far beyond the carriage walls. They didn't know exactly where they were going. Not precisely. Only that it was north, that it was important, that it was dangerous, and that the state had called. They wore their thick mining coats and work trousers, the very clothes they'd worn in the tunnels back home. Many had kept their helmets, though the lamps had been removed. A few cradled them like relics. The helmets, after all, had protected them from cave-ins and falling stone. Perhaps they might offer something now, not against radiation, but against the weight of the unknown. The train made stops, sometimes at empty platforms, other times at stations filled with soldiers, engineers, or other workers. Sometimes the miners were given tea or boiled potatoes, sometimes nothing. One stop brought a Red Cross nurse who looked them over, nodding as if to confirm they were still whole, still useful. Another brought a man in a dark uniform who said nothing but handed out new papers. Identification for zone travel. The closer they drew to the zone, the more the atmosphere changed. The air grew stiller. The trees outside looked darker. The towns they passed through looked abandoned, their windows blank, their streets silent. Soldiers patrolled every station. Dogs barked in the distance. Some buildings had been hastily covered with white cloth or tarp, and others showed signs of recent evacuation. At one point, the train paused for hours in the middle of nowhere. The miners disembarked to stretch their legs. The ground was soft beneath their boots, the grass long and unmown. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds, but it did not rain. No one knew why they'd stopped. The engine simply hissed and idled. Some men smoked. Others walked a little ways off, looking around in silence. Eventually, the train lurched forward again, and they rode through the night. Sleep came only in fragments. The benches were hard, the air inside the cars thick, with the scent of sweat, wool, and coal dust. Still, they managed. Miners are used to discomfort, used to long hours in cramped spaces, used to waiting. The final leg of the journey took them along the edge of the exclusion zone. At one point, a man pointed out the window. There, in the distance, loomed the broken shell of reactor number 4. From far away, it looked like a scar on the land, a jagged wound beneath a sky too quiet for comfort. The chimney still stood, the debris like scattered bones. Some of the miners leaned closer to the window, others turned away. No one said much. The sight did not inspire awe, only a deeper sense of what they were heading into. The train arrived at a temporary checkpoint, one of the many outer perimeters hastily set up after the explosion. Military tents were spread across a large field. Trucks came and went, full of tools, supplies, and men. The miners disembarked, clutching their bags. The air here smelled different. Stillness mixed with smoke. There was a faint metallic tang no one could quite name. They were assigned to sleeping quarters. Rows of bunks inside canvas tents, each shared by 6 to 8 men. Wooden stoves had been placed in the middle of each tent to provide heat. The nights were still cold, even in early May. Outside, floodlights cast long shadows. The glow never went away, day or night. It was always artificial, never warm. Meals were served from a large outdoor kitchen. Cabbage soup, hard bread, sometimes boiled eggs. A rotating menu that changed little. But the miners ate in silence, conserving strength, saying little. There was work ahead. They could feel it in the pace of the officers, in the nervous looks of the engineers, in the way supplies were handed out quickly and without ceremony. They were issued new clothing, not protective suits, but heavy canvas uniforms and rubber boots. A strange attempt at safety. Some whispered about the rumors, about radiation that soaked through skin, about dosimeters that clicked like mad if you stepped too far into the zone, about the helicopter pilots who had been exposed, and the firemen now buried in special lead coffins. But the miners had come anyway, not because they didn't believe the danger, but because danger was familiar. They'd lived their lives beneath the ground. They knew collapse. They knew fire. They knew the long, slow silence of being buried alive. Radiation was different, yes, but the risk was no less real. There was a briefing. A military officer stood in front of them, pointing to a crude map drawn on a canvas sheet. The idea was simple. A tunnel had to be dug beneath the reactor. It would allow a cooling system to be installed, something to keep the molten core from burning through the earth and into the water table. If that happened, it would poison the Dnieper, kill the river, kill the cities downstream. The tunnel had to be dug fast, but carefully, reinforced, stable. It had to go beneath an area where the radiation was still deadly. Machines couldn't go in, only men, miners. That night, the miners lay in their bunks and stared at the canvas ceiling. Some talked in low voices. Others lay silently, their hands folded over their chests, eyes closed but not asleep. Outside, the floodlights buzzed, trucks rumbled by, and the ruins of the reactor loomed not far beyond the tree line. The journey to the zone had ended. The real work was about to begin. The morning began not with the cry of birds or the warmth of the sun, but with the low drone of a diesel generator and the muted shuffle of boots on frozen earth. Light filtered dimly through the canvas of the tent, giving everything a gray-blue hue. The miners, who had barely slept, rose in silence. No one needed to be told twice. They dressed in the heavy, stiff uniforms they'd been issued: canvas jackets, thick trousers, gloves that were too large or too small. Some of them held on to their old mining helmets, as if the familiarity of the gear might bring some comfort. Breakfast was more functional than filling. Bread that had grown dense overnight, cheese with a rubbery texture, tea brewed strong and dark in metal pots. They sat on crates or makeshift benches, their bowls steaming in the early cold. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, diesel, and something sharper underneath, a scent that did not belong to the natural world. Then came the orders. 2 trucks pulled up, their backs open, engines idling. The miners climbed in wordlessly. As the vehicles rattled down the gravel road, they passed checkpoints, military tents, and abandoned buildings covered in sheets of plastic. Everywhere they looked, there was evidence of haste and control zones cordoned off with wooden stakes, soldiers standing with Geiger counters, signs marked with red symbols none of them had ever seen before. Eventually, the trucks stopped near the edge of the power plant complex. From a distance, reactor number 4 loomed like a half-remembered nightmare. Jagged, blackened, unfinished. The roof had been torn apart by the explosion. Nearby walls leaned slightly, like they had lost confidence in their purpose. Pieces of metal and concrete were strewn across the grounds. Workers in full-body suits moved with careful urgency. The miners were not sent into the core. That was not their role. But the tunnel they were to dig would start here, just beyond the shadow of the damaged reactor. Engineers had marked the planned route with chalk and wooden stakes. The miners gathered around the site, eyes on the disturbed soil, the rusting scaffolds, the warped metal panels. The ground had already been surveyed and cleared of the worst of the radioactive debris, but not enough to make it safe, only just enough to make it tolerable. A foreman from Donetsk stepped forward. He had worked the mines for 3 decades and had dug tunnels beneath mountains and cities. He spoke quietly, laying out the task with the calm of someone who had faced cave-ins and gas leaks without blinking. The tunnel had to be 5 meters underground, reinforced. It had to curve beneath the concrete slab that held the melted core. Time was limited, but corners could not be cut. Tools were distributed: shovels, pickaxes, metal braces, steel spades. There were no machines. The fear was that the vibrations might worsen the reactor's fragile state. Everything had to be done by hand. The first step was clearing the topsoil. The men dug in, the first swing of every pick cutting through the silence like a bell. The earth was cold, packed tight, and layered with ash. Each shovelful turned over something darker, something heavier. The farther down they went, the less they spoke. Each clink of metal on stone, each grunt of exertion became a rhythm, something old, something known. As the day wore on, the tunnel mouth took shape, a shallow slope angled downward, framed by wooden braces hastily constructed from scavenged lumber. Dirt was hauled out in wheelbarrows, carried up by teams of 2. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows across the site. Soldiers stood watch with dosimeters recording exposure times. When the limit was reached, the miners were pulled out and replaced with another crew. Breaks were few and brief. Water was provided, as were cloth masks that filtered dust, but not much else. The masks gave a sense of security, even if they did little. At one point, a man from Tula leaned on his shovel and looked toward the ruined reactor. His eyes lingered there for a while. Then he spat into the dirt and got back to work. As the first full day ended, the miners climbed back into the trucks, their hands blistered, their shoulders tight. Back at camp, they peeled off their uniforms, leaving them outside the tents to be washed or burned. Some of the men were already showing signs of exposure: nausea, headaches. It was hard to tell whether it was radiation or exhaustion, perhaps both. Inside the tents, there was a heavy quiet. Dinner was cabbage soup and black bread. The men ate slowly, each mouthful chewed more out of habit than hunger. Conversation was limited. A few men shared stories from their mines back home. One spoke of a collapse in 1978, another of a flood in '83. They weren't boasting, just remembering. Remembering that they had been through worse, or almost as bad. Later, they lay in their bunks, the canvas above them fluttering slightly in the breeze. The generator buzzed outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. One of the engineers passed through the camp with a clipboard, writing down numbers, making notes. There were plans to start bracing the interior walls of the tunnel. The soil was less stable than expected. The fire barrels outside the tents flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. A few men sat beside them, warming their hands, saying nothing. The light danced across their faces, picking out the lines, the scars, the soot that never quite washed off. These were not heroes, not in the way people used the word. They were miners, workers, survivors. Sleep came slowly, in fits and starts. The ground beneath the bunks was uneven. The night air was damp. Some of the men coughed in their sleep. One called out a name no one recognized. But eventually, silence settled over the camp like a blanket. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort but simply exists. A reminder that another day of digging waited with the dawn. The cold arrived slowly, not with snow or frost, but with the creeping damp that settled into everything. The canvas walls of the tents began to stiffen in the morning, and the ground lost its softness. Even the air changed. It smelled sharper, like wet stone and old wood. When the miners woke, their breath formed soft clouds that lingered in the stillness. No one mentioned it, but everyone felt it. The days were getting shorter. Work continued. Each morning followed the one before it, marked by the same steps. Wake up, dress, eat, load into the trucks, ride in silence past the checkpoints and tents and signs, arrive at the tunnel mouth and dig. The rhythm of it all was steady, almost hypnotic. Each man knew his place, his job, and how many minutes of rest he might get before returning to the task. The tunnel was deeper now. Reinforcements had been added, wooden beams hauled in from the surrounding region, braced together with spikes and rope. The engineers worried constantly about collapse. The soil here was unpredictable. Some days it was like digging through packed flour. Other days it was rock. The miners adjusted, changed their technique, took their time when needed. No one wanted a cave-in. There was something strangely comforting about the darkness underground. The air, while stale, was familiar. The only light came from electric lanterns strung through the shaft, casting weak halos that barely reached the walls. The men worked by memory, by feel, by years of experience. They did not need to see every detail. Their hands knew the texture of good stone, the danger of loose earth. The further in they went, the more the noise of the surface faded. There were no birds, no vehicles, no shouted orders. Only the echo of pickaxes and the sound of breathing. Occasionally, one of the younger men would hum softly under his breath, a folk tune or a lullaby remembered from childhood. The sound would carry down the tunnel, gentle and ghost-like, then vanish. At midday, they emerged like moles from the shaft. Lunch was the same every day. A bowl of barley stew, a slice of bread, a piece of boiled potato, sometimes an apple. They sat on crates or the ground, resting their backs against the trucks. The soldiers rarely spoke to them. The engineers came by to ask questions, check measurements, offer small corrections to the path. Some of the men started coughing more. One had a rash across his arms that wouldn't go away. A few had nosebleeds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Still, they worked, not because anyone forced them, but because they had come to finish the job, to dig the tunnel, to help seal the monster that had broken free from the reactor. In the evenings, the air in camp turned sharper. The fire barrels became more important. The miners gathered around them, holding out their hands, speaking in low voices. A few played cards using a tattered deck that had traveled all the way from Tula. Others mended their gloves or cleaned their boots. One man whittled a small piece of wood into the shape of a horse, slow and careful. Letters from home began to arrive. The government had promised that families would be taken care of, that their work here was noble, essential, even heroic. Some believed it, others didn't care. A letter was a reminder of the world beyond this place, of wives waiting, of children asking when Papa would be back. Some men smiled when they read, others wept quietly in the dark. One night, a group of them sat in a circle, passing around a small tin cup of something strong and illegal. The cup made its way slowly from hand to hand. They didn't drink to forget. They drank to remember laughter, a good harvest, a wedding, a summer day before the smoke and the sirens and the endless noise. Inside the tunnel, the floor was being flattened. Wooden planks were laid down to support carts. The miners dug with precision now, following chalk markings made by engineers. Each centimeter mattered. If they veered too far in either direction, they might hit a weak spot. Or worse, some worried they were getting too close, that the heat from the reactor still lingered underground, invisible and waiting. At night, the engineers met in a separate tent. They spoke in hushed tones, studying maps, adjusting blueprints. They were nervous. The readings weren't stable. The tunnel might not reach its target in time, but they said nothing to the miners. They simply nodded each morning, offered a half smile, and handed out new instructions. One evening, as the firelight flickered against the tent walls, a man began to sing. His voice was rough and low, but the tune was clear. Others joined in, quietly, respectfully. A lullaby their mothers had sung to them, a song of fields and rivers and home. For a few minutes the camp was still. The diesel generator hummed in the distance. The stars above shone cold and unblinking, and the men sang, not for themselves, but for the silence. The next day began like the others, with the cold, the bread, the ride, the digging. But something had shifted. The tunnel was nearing its mark. There was a new urgency, unspoken but felt. A tension in the shoulders, a tightness in the jaw. They had come to build a wall beneath a dying beast, to hold back the fire that had no name. And now they were nearly there. By the end of the third week, the camp had settled into a rhythm so quiet and steady that it felt more like drifting than living. Days passed, marked not by events but by the slow grind of repetition. The same gray uniforms, the same hollow wind moving between tents, the same taste of barley and weak tea. But this was how most of the miners preferred it. Routine brought comfort, and comfort was rare in a place like this. The tunnel had grown deeper. At night, the air around the entrance rose in small puffs of steam from the body heat and the machinery left behind. Wooden supports lined the shaft like ribs. The further you went, the warmer it got. Not the natural warmth of the earth, but something else. It was subtle at first, a sense that the air itself had weight, that the stones around you were not quite resting, but watching. No one talked about it. They just dug. Above ground, the chill grew sharper. October was sliding into November. Frost edged the corners of the truck beds. The fabric of gloves stiffened in the morning. Men rubbed their hands together while waiting for food. In the evenings, they gathered closer around the oil barrels. Fewer songs were sung. The laughter came more softly, like a memory rather than a sound. The camp doctor visited more often now. He wore a different kind of mask. Not the cloth ones the soldiers handed out, but something thicker, fitted with filters. He examined rashes, nosebleeds, persistent coughs. He made notes in a small ledger and told them to rest more. Some did, others didn't bother. There was work to be done, and not much time to do it. New men arrived, miners from other regions, faces no one recognized. They were thinner, younger, quieter. They slept in the overflow tents, wore coats too big or too small. One had never held a pick before. Another had trouble breathing underground. But they stayed, took their places in the line, dug beside the others as if they'd always been there. A few men had to leave. One by one, quietly, they were taken away by medical truck. No announcements, no explanations, just empty bunks the next day and an extra slice of bread at breakfast. Those who remained did not ask questions. They simply pulled their coats tighter and kept moving. The engineers became more tense. They triple-checked the maps, measured everything twice, brought in a new piece of equipment from Moscow, though no one explained what it did. Some nights, they stayed up past midnight, whispering in their tent with the lantern turned low. A few of the miners overheard fragments. Something about melting, something about collapse. Still, the work went on. Inside the tunnel, progress slowed. The soil had changed again. It was wetter now, heavier, with a strange warmth that clung to the skin. Some of the miners began to sweat more, even in the cold. Their gloves stayed damp. Their boots never quite dried out. The lamps cast long shadows that stretched and wavered like smoke. One day, they struck something unexpected. A pocket of gas, perhaps. The walls groaned. A section of timber snapped like a bone. Dust filled the tunnel. The miners retreated quickly, coughing, eyes watering. No one was seriously hurt, but the mood changed. The silence afterward was heavier than before. They reinforced the tunnel and went back in. Above ground, word spread of changes at the reactor. More concrete being poured, more soldiers deployed, a rumor that a sarcophagus was being planned, a giant structure to entomb the wreck. No one knew if it would work, but it was something to picture, something to believe in, a roof over the fire. A few miners began carving, small pieces of wood shaped into animals. A bear, a horse, a church. They placed them in a row near the fire. Small totems watching over the camp. No one said anything, but each day another figure was added. A fish, a house, a tree. One evening it snowed, just a dusting, the kind that vanishes when the sun returns. But for a few hours the camp was blanketed in quiet white. The tents looked softer, the trucks less severe. A miner stepped outside and held out his hand to catch a flake. He smiled. No one remembered the last time they saw snow. In the days that followed, they passed the halfway mark. The tunnel had reached a critical depth. They were close enough now that the engineers came down with them, lanterns in hand, pointing to walls and ceilings. Instructions were given more carefully. Paces were measured. The last stretch had begun. Still, nothing changed on the surface. Wake, work, eat, sleep, and in between, small comforts. A warm tin of tea passed from hand to hand, a joke about someone snoring, a drawing of a woman taped to a tent pole, a game of cards played by lantern light, using sticks for betting instead of coins. Some nights, the wind howled harder than usual. It pushed against the tents, made the canvas walls ripple like sails. The men listened from inside, bundled in their coats and blankets. The fire crackled. A tin cup rattled. Somewhere far away, the reactor hissed like a sleeping animal. The next morning arrived not with the crowing of roosters or the glow of sunrise, but with the same stale air and muted grayness that seemed to linger in every corner of the zone. There was no proper morning light inside the tunnel encampment, only the cold fluorescence of overhead bulbs and the intermittent flicker of power that left some areas in shadow. Sleep, if it had come at all, was shallow and fragmented, haunted by the sounds of heavy boots, the metallic clang of distant work, and the occasional groan of the earth above. The men stirred in silence. No one said much. Conversations in the mornings were limited to brief nods or muttered curses about the cold or the aching limbs that stiffened overnight. The heat, oddly, was not the kind they longed for anymore. The underground remained frigid, but the knowledge of the radiation above added a deeper, invisible discomfort that no blanket could shield them from. One by one, the miners rolled up from their bedding simple mats laid over makeshift pallets of wood, some fashioned from repurposed crates or scavenged panels. The dust clung to everything. Their boots had never truly been cleaned since arriving in the zone, and their overalls hung heavy with layers of grime and coal. Everything smelled of sweat, soil, and smoke. Each man had his own rhythm to the morning routine. Some rubbed their faces with cold water from tin basins, flinching as it shocked them awake. Others simply pulled on their gear wordlessly, preserving their energy for the punishing hours ahead. There was little variation in dress flannel shirts, thick cotton trousers, heavy-duty boots, and the ever-present hard hats, many of which had been dented or scraped in the tunnels more times than they could count. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was distributed by a rail-thin man named Yuri, who doubled as both cook and supply runner. The kitchen, such as it was, consisted of a blackened steel stove fed by scavenged wood, set up in the corner of what had once been a maintenance office. Most mornings, he offered boiled potatoes with a pinch of salt if they were lucky, and a ladle of broth made from bones that had long since surrendered their flavor. A small tin cup of black tea scalding and bitter completed the meal. There were no complaints. Complaints required energy, and that was better spent enduring the day. They ate standing up or crouched near the walls, chewing methodically, eyes staring at nothing. The underground settlement had become a place of functional silence. They had already said everything they needed to say in the first week, and now their words were rationed more carefully than food. The shift bell rang not a bell exactly, but a shrill, crackling buzz from an old alarm system wired into the generator. It meant one thing: time to descend further. The tunneling must continue. The sarcophagus walls wouldn't support themselves. The weight of the reactor above them, and the threat it carried, made every hour beneath it a race against time. The tools were already waiting for them: picks, shovels, pneumatic drills, wheelbarrows, and bucket-simple equipment that had changed little in centuries. There were a few powered tools, but the men learned not to rely on them. The electric system was prone to outages, and the engines sputtered unpredictably in the dust-clogged air. Muscle was more dependable. Muscle and will. The tunnels ahead were darker now, not just because of the natural absence of light, but because the air was thicker. There was a heaviness that settled on the chest and made the shoulders slump. It wasn't just the coal dust, though, that certainly played a part. It was the unspoken sense that they were no longer simply miners. They were men digging beneath a wound in the earth, a scar that pulsed with silent death above their heads. Today, they had to reinforce a section of the tunnel that had begun to show cracks. The walls had shifted during the night, small fissures forming where the reinforced concrete met the natural earth. It was a reminder that nothing here was stable, not the air, not the ground, not the future. The foreman barked orders. He was a barrel-chested man named Gennady, whose voice somehow still had authority after all these weeks. His thick mustache twitched when he spoke, and he always wore the same grim expression, a mix of stoicism and barely concealed worry. "Braces here. Dig down another meter, reinforce with timber, and watch the upper slab she's sagging." No one answered. They simply moved. Like a colony of ants, each man took up his place, chipping, lifting, dragging. The tunnel filled with the sounds of work, the rhythmic ring of steel on stone. the hiss of strained breath, the occasional curse when a rock slipped or support beam cracked under pressure. It was dangerous work, and everyone knew it. Sometimes a wall would shift just enough to drop dust in a fine stream. It meant pressure was building somewhere. When this happened, the men worked faster, more frantically, driven not by adrenaline, but by a deep, gnawing instinct to survive. The hours passed without announcement. Down here, there were no clocks, no sun to gauge time by. Their only markers were fatigue and the distant buzz of the lunch alarm. When it finally came, it was a relief, but a brief one. The break was short 15 minutes at most, and then it was back to the stone and silence. As they ate again boiled cabbage this time, and stale bread, there were murmurs of a new team arriving. More men from Donetsk, perhaps. The work would continue long after they were gone. The thought was strangely comforting, to know that their suffering was not in vain, that someone else would pick up the shovel if they dropped it. That afternoon, as the team continued their descent, they uncovered an underground stream. Just a thin trickle, but it changed everything. Water meant instability. The supports would need to be doubled. Gennady spat into the mud and cursed. "It's like digging in a swamp," he muttered, and began drawing new lines in the dirt for the next reinforcement. The discovery meant overtime. The tunnel would need to be secured before they could leave for the night, and so they kept digging past the hour their limbs had stopped obeying them. The sweat on their backs turned cold. Their hands blistered anew over the old scars. By the time they were dismissed, the tunnel was quiet again. The earth had settled. The new braces groaned slightly but held. The men trudged back to their camp, shoulders stooped, faces blank. The air smelled of sulfur and wet soil. There was no conversation. That night, one of the younger miners, a lanky man named Oleg, sat by the fire in the break area and quietly played a tune on a battered harmonica. No one had asked him to. It was a soft, meandering tune, melancholy and slow, the kind that reminded them of places far away. Green fields, children's laughter, home. No one spoke. They listened. Not because the tune was beautiful, though it was, but because in that moment it reminded them that they were still alive, still human. That even beneath the ruins of the worst disaster they had ever known, in the shadow of a dying machine, they could still feel something. Sleep came slowly. The dreams, when they arrived, were thick with noise and light. Explosions, the roar of concrete collapsing, the scent of burning metal. But through it all, the tune lingered, a memory of music in the dark. And in the morning, they would rise again, pick up the shovel, face the dust in silence, because that's what they were sent to do. And that's what they would keep doing until the tunnel was finished, or until the earth decided otherwise. They began working in shifts around the clock. The engineers said the tunnel had to be completed within days, not weeks, days. The tone of their voices was different now. Urgent, though they tried not to sound alarmed. But the miners could tell. They always could. You can only live beneath the earth for so long before you learn to read people the way you read rock. There was tension in the shoulders, a tightness around the mouth, the kind that came from fear. So they worked. Day blurred into night. The fire pit outside never went out. A kettle of water always hung nearby, kept warm so the men could sip something hot when they came up, blinking against the dull gray sky. The tunnel had grown longer, deeper. The air inside was dense now. The lamps didn't shine as far. Even sound seemed to thicken. Conversations became murmurs. Picks struck the walls in slow, careful rhythm. Inside the shaft, the earth felt warmer. Not like a spring thaw or the rich breath of soil after rain, but a deep, unnatural warmth. the kind that seeped into your bones and left your skin damp. A few men began coughing more. A few had headaches that lingered longer. But there was no time to dwell. There was only the work. Outside, the camp settled into a strange kind of silence. The wind had stopped. The smoke from the barrels rose straight up, unbothered by a breeze. The dogs had stopped barking. The birds that once circled overhead were gone. Even the hum of trucks had lessened. Fewer deliveries came. Fewer officers passed through. It was as if the outside world was retreating, slowly pulling back and leaving the camp to its task. One night, a group of soldiers arrived carrying wooden crates. They didn't speak, just delivered the boxes and left. Inside were small boxes of iodine tablets. Each man received one. "Take it," the doctor said. "Don't ask questions." So they did. The tablets were bitter, left a metallic taste behind, but no one argued. Not anymore. The younger miners grew quieter. They kept their heads down, watched the older ones, mimicked their movements, watched how they held the pick, how they placed their feet, how they rested without wasting heat. They were learning more now than any school could teach. They were learning how to survive. Somewhere beyond the camp, another wall was being built. Concrete walls, metal beams, a dome, they said, to hold the fire in. The men talked about it sometimes at night, wondering if their tunnel would even be needed once it was done. But no one said they wanted to stop. Not really. If nothing else, the digging gave them purpose. A rhythm, a reason to rise each morning. The tunnel now curved slightly. The engineers had redirected it to avoid an unexpected pocket of gas. The detour made the journey longer. Every wheelbarrow load of soil had to be pushed farther. Every support beam had to be cut shorter to accommodate the bend. It was slow, aching work. But they did it, each man in step with the next, one foot, then the other. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, the firelight inside the shaft flickered strangely. The shadows bent in odd directions. The lamps swayed when there was no breeze. The men didn't talk about it, just adjusted their scarves, tightened their grips, and kept digging. Meals became simpler. Boiled potatoes, thin stew, bread so hard it had to be soaked before chewing. But it was food, and they ate it without complaint. Hunger sharpened in the cold, but habit dulled the edge. One evening, an older miner named Petrov didn't return from the tunnel on time. A team went in after him. They found him sitting on a pile of dirt, eyes closed, breathing slow. "Just tired," he said. Just needed a moment. They helped him back to camp, sat him by the fire. He sipped water, wrapped in an extra coat. The next day he was back at work, slower, quieter. But there, the miners kept a small chalkboard near the tool tent. Each day, someone scratched a new number on it, the distance left to dig. As the numbers grew smaller, the faces grew more focused. There was no celebration, no cheering, just nods. Quiet acknowledgement that they were almost there. Some men began writing letters home. Not to send, of course. There was no postal service here. But just to write, to remember. Folded pages tucked into boots or under pillows. Words for mothers, wives, children. Words they might never speak aloud. The nights grew longer, the days more gray. Snow fell again, thicker this time, covered the tents, the barrels, the tracks left by boots. The world softened. Sound disappeared under the white. The camp became quiet in a new way, wrapped in silence like a blanket. They continued to dig. The tunnel was nearing its final stretch. You could feel it, even without the chalkboard numbers. The air shifted slightly with every foot gained. It was warmer, still, and damp. The walls sweated like the men did. Sometimes the picks stuck to the soil, as if the earth was reluctant to give way. The tunnel no longer felt like it belonged to the ground. It felt like something else, like they had broken through into a place they weren't supposed to be. Each step now was deliberate. Each support beam was checked and rechecked. The engineers said they were close to the foundation of the reactor. The ground above their heads was changing. Lighter soil, more brittle. That meant the heat from above had worked its way down. It meant they were directly underneath the burning core. There was no more talk about timelines or shifts. Just quiet work, quiet eyes, quiet resolve. Outside, the days bled into one another. The sky hung low, forever pale, like a stretched canvas of ash. The snow came and went, melted, then returned. The fire barrel was kept fed with any wood they could find, even the legs of broken stools or old crates. Anything that would burn. Some men had stopped speaking entirely, not out of fear or sadness, just out of exhaustion. Their movements had become routine, almost ceremonial. Wash your face with lukewarm water, eat bread, drink tea, wrap your boots tight, go underground, return, repeat. The rhythm was sacred now. The doctors visited less often. There wasn't much they could do. A few men had nosebleeds that wouldn't stop easily. Others coughed more deeply, their voices scratchy like gravel. Still they worked. No one wanted to be the one to stop. Not this close. Not now. The younger miners had started to take on more responsibility. They led shifts, carried the heavier gear, held the lanterns higher when the path darkened. Their shoulders looked broader now, their eyes a little older. This place was aging them by the week, but they didn't complain. The engineers brought down new equipment, a thick metal pipe, a sensor, instructions to dig the final chamber where cooling units might be installed if the plan succeeded. The idea was to stop the meltdown from spreading downward, to stop it from reaching the water table. If it did, they said, the explosion would poison half of Europe. The miners nodded, said nothing, and returned to work. There was no use in panicking about the sky falling. Better to finish digging. In the evenings, the fire by the tents glowed like a second sun. Men sat around it with steaming bowls of buckwheat, warming their hands on the metal cups. Someone always brought out a harmonica, played a few simple notes. Not cheerful ones, just soft, slow tunes. The kind that reminded you of long roads and dim kitchens and quiet homes. Someone sometimes sang under their breath, a lullaby for grown men in the middle of nowhere. The tunnel now ran so close to the foundation that you could sometimes hear faint groans in the earth above, shifting, settling, a reminder of the unimaginable weight pressing down. No one dared to dig too quickly. Precision was everything now. Shovel, scoop, place, hammer, tap, listen. It became a kind of prayer. There was a moment deep in the shaft when one of the lanterns went out. Just a flicker, then darkness. The men froze, held their breath. A second later, another lantern died. A cough echoed. Someone whispered, "Light the spare." A match flared, tiny and pale. The tunnel came back into view. No one said anything. They kept digging. Sometimes, the ground felt like it hummed. A low vibration, just at the edge of perception. It wasn't mechanical. It was deeper than that. Like the earth itself was breathing, disturbed by what had been built above it, or broken. A miner named Semyon left a note near the fire one night. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It just said, "If this stops the fire, tell my daughter I helped." His handwriting was small, neat, folded into a square, tucked under a rock. The final chamber was nearly done. They reinforced the walls with timber, secured the floor with planks, ran the last lengths of pipe. The engineers stepped in more now, offering instructions. Voices tight, movements hurried. The plan had changed again, or maybe it hadn't. The miners didn't ask. They just widened the tunnel a bit more, smoothed the ground, swept away the dust. The work was ending. The kind of ending you don't celebrate, just acknowledge. A nod, a sigh, a final swing of the pick. One by one, the miners stood in the mouth of the shaft, looking back at what they had carved. A hollow path through solid earth, a scar beneath a wound. They didn't smile, just stared for a moment, then turned toward the surface. On June 24, 1986, after 38 days, the impossible was done. The tunnel was complete. A 150-meter passage led to a large chamber, ready for the heat exchanger. The miners had done their job. Construction engineers moved in to pour a massive concrete slab and install the complex refrigeration equipment. The system was tested and declared operational. The last line of defense was in place. The men who emerged from that tunnel for the last time must have felt a profound mix of relief, pride, and utter exhaustion. They posed for a photograph in front of the ruined reactor, holding a banner that read, "We carried out the mission ordered by the government." They had faced the inferno and survived. And then came the final, cruel twist. The heat exchanger they had sacrificed so much to build was never used. In the weeks it took them to dig, scientists got better readings from inside the reactor. To their immense relief, they realized the corium was cooling down on its own, faster than they'd predicted. It was solidifying. The doomsday machine was powering down. The nightmare scenario wasn't going to happen. Their monumental effort, it turned out, was for a worst-case scenario that never came to pass. The tunnel and chamber were simply filled with concrete, creating another thick barrier between the reactor and the groundwater below. Their work wasn't entirely for nothing. It became part of the final containment structure. But the urgent, life-or-death reason they'd toiled in such horrific conditions was now gone. For the miners, this was a source of deep bitterness. They went in believing they were the only thing standing between Europe and apocalypse. They endured the heat and radiation, driven by that purpose. To learn it was for a threat that had already faded was a devastating blow. One survivor later expressed this feeling of futility, the sense that they had died for nothing. Their health had been compromised for a fire that was already burning itself out. What happened to the men who dug the tunnel? They got their bonuses and certificates, and then they were sent home. They returned to their families, forever changed, carrying the dust of Chernobyl in their lungs and its radiation in their bones. The exact number of miners who died as a direct result of their work is shrouded in Soviet secrecy and the complexities of radiation sickness. Specific, dramatic figures are often cited online, but are difficult to verify. What we do know is that the liquidators, the term for all cleanup workers, suffered significant health problems. Long-term studies of over 100,000 Ukrainian liquidators found a clear, statistically significant increase in the risk for cancers like leukemia. But beyond the physical toll were the psychological scars, high rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. This trauma was made worse by a sense of being abandoned. For years, many fought with bureaucracy to get the pensions and health care they were promised. Their heroism, so vital in the moment, was quickly forgotten by the state they served. So, was their sacrifice in vain? It's a haunting question. If the heat exchanger was never turned on, did they suffer for nothing? The answer is more complex. In May 1986, the officials in charge were operating with limited, terrifying information. They couldn't afford to gamble with the fate of a continent. They had to act based on the worst-case scenario. The tunnel was an insurance policy against Armageddon. The fact they never had to cash that policy doesn't mean it was a mistake to buy it. Their work, even unused, was a necessary precaution against an unthinkable horror. As one engineer put it, the mission's goal wasn't met only because the radioactive reactions stopped on their own. They did the work that the science of the day demanded. They were heroes, not because of a cinematic victory, but because they were willing to try. They were ordinary men asked to do the impossible, and they did it. They walked into the mouth of hell, not for fame, but because they were told it had to be done. The story of the Chernobyl miners is just one of many tales of incredible, often forgotten bravery from the disaster. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. If you found this account compelling and want to explore more hidden histories, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We'd like to hear from you. What aspect of the miner's story do you find most shocking or inspiring? Let us know in the comments below. In the end, the legacy of the Chernobyl miners isn't the cooling system that was never turned on. It's their presence. Their willingness to descend into that tunnel day after day. They were a human shield, a final, desperate barrier between a melting nuclear core and the world. Their work stands as a testament to human resilience and the profound, often tragic, meaning of duty. They are the unsung heroes of Chernobyl, their memory etched not in monuments, but in the dark, silent, concrete-filled tunnel that still lies beneath the sarcophagus, a memorial to the men who dug their own potential graves to save millions. And that is a sacrifice that should never be forgotten.